A twisted childhood folkloric figure is made into an absolute horror, and the perceptions of reality buffer a character's interactions with others to follow. This story is one that is rather complex, with a depth that I think I've yet to really experience so far in this series of short story Sundays. It is structured a little bit different and goes over some different ideas that make it a little bit harder to interpret overall. First off, it starts with a few letters that reminded me a lot of Lovecraft personally, but then it spins into a more traditional third-person narration, and there is a lot to enjoy within the overall story itself. But let's just say I wasn't exactly expecting what I got from this one overall. I liked what I understood, but some of the rest of it I'm just trying to piece together to some degree, but not sure how well I did so. There's a lot of confusion involved with trying to get this story. So overall, I give The Sandman a 4 out of 5, rounded up. Let's begin with speaking of the Sandman as folklore. Now, keep in mind, I did not grow up with the Sandman as a folkloric figure, so maybe some of my information here is incorrect. Take it with a grain of salt. But somebody who has experienced those folklores growing up may be able to correct me in the comments. The Sandman is largely based on an actual folkloric figure named the Sandman. This supposed Sandman would, I think, based on the original story, but maybe there's different versions of it, and maybe I'm totally wrong here in the first place, sprinkle sand into kids' eyes as a means of drowning them, that's not what I wanted to say. Drowsing them and putting them to sleep, as a means of getting kids to fall asleep. An idea that parents could say the Sandman is coming, and instead of getting sand sprinkled in your eyes, you just kind of go to sleep. Be a sort of encouragement for kids to go to bed on time with that phrase, "Here comes the Sandman," or whatever that may be. But whether or not those specific elements of the Sandman are true or correct, Hoffman's depiction of the Sandman is just a little bit different. There's a darker twist to this character, namely in the way that perception is involved, because there's a big focus on eyes and perception and reality that is also associated with the character, besides just, influencing kids to actually go to sleep. He's not just an encouragement for sleep. He will literally rip out the eyes of youngsters who don't. This version of the Sandman will. He's also maybe not necessarily a monster, as folklore may or may not depict characters like this, generally depending on where you're coming from and what kind of folklore tale it is. But maybe he is a monster, but he can definitely shapeshift in one way or another, or at least make his appearance a little bit less easily identifiable, for sure. The Sandman as a manifestation for the main character of the story named Nathaniel comes in two forms. The first is a character I think named Coppelius, and I forget which one is German and which one is Italian. There are two different versions of this character, but they both exist. I forget the exact details, but let's first talk about Coppelius. We first see the Sandman in the form of this punishing character. As far as we can guess, Coppelius is an alchemist working with Nathaniel's father when Nathaniel is a young kid. Nathaniel, as the main character of the story, grows up with this folklore of the Sandman, this tale that his mother tells him, and the other young kids saying, like, the Sandman is coming, you better get to bed. And so they go to bed, because the idea is if the Sandman catches you being too attentive and trying to see him, trying to locate him, trying to find him when he does come, whether or not he's real, as the mother tries to deny at one point in the early portion of the story, the Sandman will rip out your eyes as a kid for doing that. That's kind of a horrifying picture, but that seems to be the case with this version of the character. But Nathaniel, one night, despite being told that the Sandman is coming, despite being told that the Sandman doesn't actually exist, decides to tries to stay up late one night to actually see the figure and see what's going on. He sees this figure with his dad trying to work on bringing something to life, using alchemy in some strange way for some strange purpose that he doesn't fully understand. The Sandman, as Coppelius, as this one character, sees this, notices Nathaniel's eyes, and tries to enact his evil justice on Nathaniel for, not going to bed, not drowsing off and going to sleep. Nathaniel's father, however, stops Coppelius, but then later dies in a mysterious accident, which might be revenge for stopping the Sandman from doing what he intended to do. But Coppelius, the Sandman in this one form, apparently disappears and is never seen again. Most of the portion of the story that we've talked about so far happens in 3 letters in an epistolary format in the story. You get Nathaniel writing a letter to a friend named Lothar, something like that, who has a sister named Clara, one of those 2 pronunciations, I don't even know, whom Nathaniel is in a relationship with. Nathaniel and Lothar are friends. Nathaniel and Clara are in a relationship. Nathaniel writes a letter to Lothar conveying, this sort of portion of the story and the fact that he thinks he sees the Sandman again in a new form. Clara reads this letter out of her place and sends, Nathaniel a letter back, and then Nathaniel sends a short correspondence back again. But that's just how the story starts. But most of the inciting incident of the story comes from the fact that Nathaniel notices the Sandman, sees him again as Coppola, I think is how the name is pronounced, as an arbiter of perception and reality, or at least my interpretation of this version of the character. We see him in this new form. Coppola is now, instead of an alchemist, or instead of explicitly as an alchemist, as a glassmaker or something along those lines. He makes barometers, he makes lenses and scopes, various different versions of glass stuff. Nathaniel spots this man out in a crowd, though definitely different than Coppelius, and apparently one of them's more Italian, one of them's more German. I don't know the distinguished features that allows Nathaniel to be able to tell this, but Nathaniel can just tell that these 2 people are the same. He sees Coppola as like, that is the Sandman from when I was a child. Clara, of course, tries to tell him that that's not the case, but, Nathaniel's rather insistent. But this new character, Coppola, works with another man, an Italian name that I'm not going to pronounce very well, and I apologize, Spallanzani or something like that, working on something relatively unknown. We do find out later in the story that Nathaniel's perception is quite clouded by certain stuff, however, within this portion of the story. Like I said, Nathaniel and Clara are in a relationship, and although Nathaniel seems to only have eyes for Clara, there comes a point when his eyes kind of shift over to Olympia, the supposed daughter of Spallanzani. This Olympia suddenly enthralls Nathaniel, and he forgets all about his previous relationship with Clara. Olympia is able to block out the perception that Nathaniel has of his life prior. He's just enthralled by this character. It turns out that what the Sandman was working on with Nathaniel's father earlier was probably an automaton, and an automaton is what Olympia is, what Coppola has been working on with Spallanzani. So a connection that kind of more or less proves that Coppelius and Coppola are probably the same character, aside from, the obvious titular Sandman title and the fact that the names are pretty similar. This is evidence that they're probably the same. Nathaniel is saved from this infatuation through some degree of interference and other bad events occurring, and returns to Clara, but also a little bit mentally changed from this experience. Unfortunately, in the midst of a wedding material, getting ready for a wedding or whatever it was that they were doing, Clara and Nathaniel go to gaze around from a church, see the land beyond. Nathaniel takes out a scope that was at one point given to him by Coppola, sees what he thinks is another Clara in a bush somewhere, and guesses that this has to mean that either one of them, or maybe even both, are automatons. Neither one of them is real, and so attempts to kill Clara, but instead kills himself after Clara is saved and he is locked at the top of the church. All the while, as Nathaniel jumps from a very tall height, Coppelius/Coppola, whichever version it was, I forget which, probably the latter, watches from the street below, having gotten his supposed revenge, affecting Nathaniel's perception to such a degree that he loses his mind in the end. Everything continues to relate to this idea of perception within the story, this idea of reality, eyes, the uncanny, being unable to tell people from non-people, eyes which the Sandman takes from kids, perception of uncanny robots versus people and the experience of others, using science, both pseudoscience and real science, to bend the idea of real people and what makes humanity versus inhumanity thing, and obviously taking that uncanny valley, this thing that is inherently creepy to us, this idea that like we don't like something that looks too real, that's too potentially even too good to be true, this inherent fear that kind of humanity has. There's a lot of cool ideas in this story. Some of this interpretation of what I think happened, or the reasons behind it, or what the Sandman is, or whatever else is going on is, like I said, basically just my personal interpretation. It's my personal understanding of the story as it exists. I definitely think I'm wrong about some points of the story, and I apologize for that, but there is a lot of great content and ideas in here. I really enjoyed the novella, though it is not a favorite, but it had a lot of material that was a lot harder to interpret. Like I said, this is my interpretation. Plenty of it is probably wrong, but that is the way that I think I see things at the moment. If you have any other ideas as to the interpretation of the story, please let me know some of those in the comments below. Let me know what you think I definitely got wrong. Let me know how poorly I pronounced basically every name in this story. I apologize, but that is basically the gist of what I think was going on. This one is definitely intriguing. This one probably would require a second or maybe even a third reading to really get the most out of it, because there's a lot going on in this one that I'm not sure I fully understood.